Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true camping horror stories that will make you reconsider ever venturing into the wilderness alone. These are not fictional tales created for entertainment, but genuine accounts from people who experienced unexplainable terror in some of the most remote and isolated locations across North America. Each story has been meticulously compiled from first-hand testimonials, incident reports, and investigative research that confirms these events actually occurred. From national park campgrounds to backcountry wilderness areas, the places we seek for peace and solitude can sometimes harbor dangers that defy rational explanation. What you are about to hear includes encounters with human predators who stalk the vulnerable, unexplained phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, and mysteries that remain unsolved to this very day. If you appreciate genuine horror content grounded in real experiences that will leave you unsettled long after the video ends, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our latest deep dives into documented cases of the unknown. After you finish listening to these harrowing accounts, we encourage you to share your own camping experiences or unexplained encounters in the comments section below, as your stories help build our community of truth seekers. Now settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we journey into the darkness that awaits those who dare to camp where civilization ends. Liam had been planning the camping trip for months. After a brutal year of working overtime at the accounting firm, he desperately needed to disconnect from spreadsheets, emails, and the constant hum of city life. His girlfriend Sarah had been equally enthusiastic about the idea. They researched remote campgrounds across 3 states before settling on a national park in northern Montana, a place known for its rugged beauty and sparse visitor traffic. The park ranger they spoke with on the phone assured them that late October was the perfect time to visit. Most tourists had already left for the season, and the fall colors would be at their peak. What the ranger did not mention was that the isolation could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with wildlife. They arrived at the trailhead parking area on a Friday afternoon as the sun began its descent toward the mountain ridgeline. The parking lot could accommodate maybe 20 vehicles, but only one other car was there when they pulled in. It was a dusty, dark blue SUV with Idaho plates, parked at an odd angle that took up 2 spaces. Liam noticed that the vehicle had seen better days. The rear bumper was dented, one taillight was cracked, and the windows were tinted darker than seemed legal. Something about it felt off, but he dismissed the feeling as urban paranoia. Out here in the wilderness, people drove rough vehicles. It meant nothing. They shouldered their packs and started down the trail. The hike to their chosen campsite was only 3 miles, but the terrain was challenging. The path climbed steadily through dense forest, crossing several small creeks and navigating around massive boulders that looked like they had tumbled from the cliffs above sometime in the distant past. Sarah was in good spirits, pointing out interesting mushrooms and the occasional bird darting through the underbrush. Liam found himself relaxing with each step, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders as the sounds of civilization faded behind them. They reached their campsite just as twilight began to settle over the forest. It was a beautiful spot. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a fire ring made of blackened stones at its center. A weathered wooden post marked the site with a faded number 7. They set up their tent with practiced efficiency, having camped together enough times to work as a team without needing to communicate much. Within an hour, they had their shelter secure, their sleeping bags rolled out, and a small fire crackling cheerfully in the ring. Liam heated water for freeze-dried meals while Sarah organized their supplies. As darkness fully descended, they noticed something strange. The forest was quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a calm evening, but an oppressive silence that felt unnatural. No owls hooted in the distance. No small animals rustled through the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have died completely, leaving the pine branches motionless against the star-filled sky. Sarah mentioned it first, her voice uncertain as she looked around at the dark trees encircling their small bubble of firelight. Liam tried to reassure her. Perhaps they were between animal territories. Perhaps the local wildlife was simply elsewhere tonight. But even as he spoke, he felt the wrongness of it. He had spent enough time in wild places to know that forests were never truly silent. There was always something moving, always some creature going about its nocturnal business. This stillness felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They finished their meal and sat by the fire for another hour, talking quietly about their plans for the weekend. They would explore some of the less traveled trails tomorrow, maybe find a good spot for wildlife photography. Sarah had brought her camera specifically to capture some of the park's resident elk. Eventually, as the fire burned down to coals and the cold began to seep through their jackets, they decided to turn in for the night. Liam doused the remaining embers thoroughly, a habit drilled into him by years of responsible camping. They crawled into their tent, zipped it shut, and settled into their sleeping bags. Liam checked his watch one last time before turning off his headlamp. It was just past 11. He closed his eyes and listened to Sarah's breathing slow as she drifted toward sleep. He was nearly asleep himself when he heard the first footstep. It was unmistakable. The soft crunch of a boot on fallen pine needles, somewhere just outside the ring of darkness surrounding their tent. Liam's eyes snapped open. He lay perfectly still, every sense suddenly alert. Another step, then another. Someone was walking around their campsite in a slow circle, their footfalls deliberate and measured. Sarah stirred beside him, her hand finding his arm in the darkness. She had heard it too. Neither of them spoke. They barely breathed. The footsteps continued, maintaining that same steady pace, circling the tent again and again. Liam's mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps another camper had gotten lost and was looking for their own site. Perhaps it was a ranger doing some kind of night patrol. But why would anyone walk in circles without calling out or using a light? Then the voice came, and Liam's blood went cold. "Hello in the tent. This is Park Ranger Davidson. I need you to come out here, please." The voice was male, probably middle-aged, with a flat effect that sounded wrong somehow. There was no warmth in it, no concern, just a mechanical quality that made the hairs on the back of Liam's neck stand up. Liam found his voice, though it came out rough. "What is this about?" "This area has been closed due to an emergency situation. All campers need to evacuate immediately. I need you to pack your things and come with me right now." Something about the phrasing bothered Liam. Park rangers did not work alone at night. They traveled, yet in pairs for safety, and always used radios. And if there was a genuine emergency requiring evacuation, there would be multiple personnel, vehicles, probably even helicopters, depending on the situation. This lone voice in the darkness, offering no explanation and no evidence of authority, set off every alarm bell in Liam's mind. "Can you show me your identification?" Liam called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "And can you tell me what the emergency is?" There was a long pause. The footsteps had stopped. Liam could sense the person standing just outside the tent, considering how to respond. When the voice came again, there was an edge to it that had not been there before. "I do not have time for this. You need to come out here now. Grab your things and follow me." "Where is your vehicle?" Liam pressed. Rangers do not hike out to campsites without transportation. Where are you parked? Another pause, longer this time. Sarah had moved closer to Liam, her hand now gripping his arm tightly. He could feel her trembling in the darkness. His own heart was pounding so hard, he was certain it must be audible outside the tent. My truck is down the trail. You will follow me to it. Both of you need to come out now. Liam made a decision. We are not leaving this tent. If you are actually a ranger, you can radio for backup, and we will speak to multiple officers. Otherwise, we are staying right here until morning. The silence that followed was worse than anything that had come before. It stretched on for seconds that felt like hours. Then the footsteps resumed, but this time they did not circle. They stopped directly in front of the tent door, no more than 3 feet from where Liam and Sarah lay. Open this tent. The voice was different now, stripped of any pretense of authority. It was low and threatening, with an undercurrent of barely controlled rage. Open it now, or I will open it for you. Liam's hand moved slowly to his pack, feeling for the knife he kept there. It was a small folding blade, meant for cutting rope and preparing food. But it was better than nothing. His fingers closed around it just as he saw the shadow. The moon had risen while they had been talking, and its pale light was just strong enough to make shapes visible through the tent's mesh windows. The shadow of a man stood at the tent entrance, tall and broad-shouldered. But there was no uniform visible, no radio antenna, no ranger hat. Just the silhouette of someone wearing what looked like a heavy jacket and a baseball cap. The figure stood there for what might have been 5 minutes, or might have been an hour. Time lost all meaning in that darkness, with that presence looming over their fragile nylon shelter. Liam could hear breathing now, heavy and steady, almost like the person was working to control their anger. He tightened his grip on the knife and positioned himself between Sarah and the tent door, ready to fight if it came to that. Then, without warning, the figure moved, but instead of attacking the tent, it simply stepped back into the darkness. The footsteps receded a few yards and then stopped. Liam realized with horror that the person had not left. They were still there, just outside the reach of the moonlight, watching and waiting. The hours that followed were the longest of Liam's life. He and Sarah lay rigid in their sleeping bags, neither sleeping nor speaking, listening to the occasional rustle that indicated their unwanted visitor was still present. Twice more during the night, they heard footsteps circling the tent. Once, something scraped against the tent fabric, a sound like fingers dragging across the nylon. But the mysterious person never tried to force entry. They simply maintained their vigil, a predator content to wait. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the trees, Liam heard footsteps one last time. But these were different, purposeful and departing, moving away from the campsite and down the trail toward the parking area. He waited another 30 minutes until the forest was fully illuminated by morning sun before daring to unzip the tent. The campsite looked exactly as they had left it. Their packs sat where they had placed them. The fire ring was undisturbed. But when Liam walked the perimeter of the camp, he found the footprints. Dozens of them, circling the tent in overlapping loops, pressed deep into the soft earth. They were made by large boots, size 11 or 12, with a distinctive waffle pattern on the soles. They packed with frantic speed, barely speaking, both of them desperate to get out of that place. The hike back to the trailhead took half the time it had taken to hike in. When they emerged into the parking lot, Liam's truck was still there, exactly where they had left it. But the blue SUV was also still there, sitting in those same 2 spaces, looking even more sinister in the daylight. Liam did not hesitate. He pulled out his phone, grateful to finally have cell service again, and called the park ranger station. He reported everything: the man claiming to be a ranger, the all-night stalking, the vehicle in the parking lot. The ranger he spoke with sounded genuinely alarmed and promised to send someone immediately. They waited in their locked truck for 45 minutes until a ranger vehicle arrived. 2 actual rangers emerged, both in proper uniform, both carrying radios. Liam told them the entire story while they inspected the blue SUV from a safe distance. One of them called in the license plate. The response over the radio made both rangers exchange a grim look. The vehicle was registered to a man named Carl Mitchell. He was a convicted felon with a history of violent assault and attempted kidnapping. He had served 8 years in prison and been released on parole 14 months earlier. His last known address was in Idaho, but he had failed to report to his parole officer 6 weeks ago. There was an active warrant for his arrest. One ranger stayed with Liam and Sarah, while the other called for backup. Within an hour, the small parking lot was filled with law enforcement vehicles. They searched the SUV, and what they found turned Liam's stomach. In the back cargo area, they discovered zip ties, duct tape, a hunting knife, and a length of rope. In the glove box were handwritten notes describing the park's remote campsites and the typical patterns of visitors. Carl Mitchell was never found. Despite an extensive search of the park and the surrounding wilderness, he vanished without a trace. Dogs lost his scent a mile from the trailhead. Helicopters saw no sign of him. It was as if he had simply melted into the forest. 2 weeks after the incident, Liam received a call from a detective working the case. 2 hikers had gone missing in that same national park the previous year, a young couple in their 20s. They had been camping at a backcountry site, much like Liam and Sarah. Their tent and gear were found untouched, but they were never seen again. The case had gone cold with no leads and no evidence of what happened to them. The detective did not say it directly, but the implication was clear. Liam and Sarah had encountered a predator, someone who stalked the remote places where people go to feel safe and alone. They had survived only because Liam had trusted his instincts and refused to leave the tent. Others had not been so fortunate. Liam never camped in that park again. In fact, he rarely camped anywhere anymore. The wilderness had lost its appeal, tainted by the memory of that voice in the darkness and the shadow that stood watch over their tent through those terrible hours. Sometimes, late at night, he still heard that flat, mechanical voice demanding he open the tent. And he wondered how many others had heard the same voice, in how many other remote places, and how many of them had made the fatal mistake of believing it was really a ranger. Noah had never been particularly superstitious. He approached life with a practical mindset shaped by his engineering degree and a general skepticism toward anything that could not be measured or explained. So when his 3 college friends proposed a camping trip to the Appalachian Mountains near the ruins of an old mining settlement, his concerns were purely practical. Would the trails be maintained? Was the weather forecast favorable? Did they have adequate supplies? The possibility of encountering something supernatural never crossed his mind. The trip was Marcus's idea. He had stumbled across references to an abandoned mining town called Harwick while researching local history for a photography project. The town had thrived briefly in the 1880s, supporting nearly 300 people who worked the coal seams running through the mountains. But a catastrophic mine collapse in 1887 had killed 14 men, and the town never recovered. Within 5 years, everyone had moved away, leaving the site to slowly decay back into the forest. Marcus was fascinated by the idea of photographing the ruins. and he convinced Noah, Tyler, and Brandon that it would make for an interesting weekend adventure. They drove up on a Friday evening in early November, the mountains already showing the bare bones of winter. The leaves had fallen, leaving the trees skeletal against a gray sky. They stopped at a small tavern in the nearest town to grab dinner before heading to the trailhead. The place was typical of rural mountain establishments. Dark wood paneling, a scarred bar, local men nursing beers and watching a football game on an outdated television. The bartender was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and hands weathered by decades of hard work. When Marcus mentioned where they were headed, her expression changed. She set down the glass she had been wiping and looked at each of them in turn. "You boys know about that place?" she asked, her Appalachian accent thick and deliberate. Marcus smiled, assuming she was about to share some local folklore. "We know it is an old mining town. We are just going to camp nearby and check out the ruins." The woman did not smile back. "That land is watched over. People who go there feel unwelcome. Some hear things, some see things. I would recommend you find somewhere else to spend your weekend." Tyler laughed it off, thanking her for the warning, but insisting they would be fine. The woman shrugged and went back to her work. But Noah noticed she kept glancing at them with an expression somewhere between pity and resignation, as if she had seen this scene play out before and knew how it ended. They reached the trailhead just before dark and hiked the 2 miles to the site by flashlight. The ruins were more extensive than Noah had expected. Foundations of buildings jutted from the forest floor like broken teeth. Rusted machinery parts lay half buried in decades of leaf litter. A few structures still had partial walls standing, though the roofs had long since collapsed. In the dim beam of their flashlights, the place looked eerie but not threatening. Just sad, a testament to ambition and tragedy. They set up camp in a clearing about 50 yards from the main cluster of ruins, near where the mining office had once stood. A historical marker, weathered and barely legible, provided some basic facts about the settlement. Noah read it while the others pitched tents. 14 men killed in the collapse. Bodies never recovered due to unstable conditions. Mine sealed permanently. The usual grim footnote of industrial history. They built a fire and settled in for the evening, passing around a flask of whiskey and talking about classes, relationships, and plans for after graduation. The conversation was easy and familiar, the kind of aimless talk that comes naturally among old friends. Marcus took some long exposure shots of the ruins by firelight, pleased with the atmospheric results. By midnight, they were all ready for sleep. Noah crawled into the tent he shared with Tyler, grateful for his warm sleeping bag as the temperature continued to drop. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive and hike. He woke suddenly at 3:17 in the morning, according to his phone. Something had pulled him from sleep, though he could not immediately identify what. He lay still, listening. Tyler was snoring softly beside him. Outside, the fire had died to nothing. The forest was absolutely silent. Then he saw the figure. It was standing at the very edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet from the tent. Barely visible in the faint moonlight that filtered through the bare branches, it appeared to be a man. Tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like old work clothes. The figure was completely motionless, facing toward the tents. Noah's first thought was that one of the others had gotten up to relieve themselves. But the shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, and standing in a posture that seemed unnatural. No one stood that still, especially not in the cold. He watched the figure for several seconds, his rational mind trying to supply an explanation. A tree stump that looked like a person in the darkness. A trick of shadows and moonlight, But even as he considered these possibilities, he knew they were wrong. This was not a natural formation. It was something standing there, watching them. Noah reached for his flashlight, moving slowly so as not to wake Tyler. His fingers had just closed around it when the figure moved. Not walked, but shifted position instantaneously, like a film with frames cut out. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing. The next moment it was 10 feet closer. Noah's breath caught in his throat. That was not possible. Nothing moved like that. He blinked hard, wondering if he was still asleep, caught in some vivid dream. But when he opened his eyes, the figure was closer still, now less than 20 feet from the tent. He had seen it move. It had simply appeared in a new location, as if teleporting across the clearing. Terror flooded through him, primal and overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, unable to move or even cry out. The figure stood there, and though he could not make out any features in the darkness, he had the absolute certainty that it was staring directly at him. Noah squeezed his eyes shut, counting to 5, willing this to be a dream. When he opened them, the figure was gone. He sat up so fast, he hit his head on the tent's roof, gasping. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with the flashlight, finally getting it turned on. He swept the beam across the clearing, illuminating trees, dead grass, scattered leaves. Nothing else. He was about to convince himself it had been a hallucination, some product of an exhausted mind, when his flashlight died. Not a gradual dimming as batteries failed, but an instant death, as if someone had flipped a switch. He shook it frantically, but it remained dark. Then he heard the whispers. They came from all around the tent, not words exactly, but sounds that suggested language. Low and urgent, like multiple people having a conversation just below the threshold of comprehension. The voices were masculine, rough, speaking in rhythm but with no discernible meaning. The sound raised goosebumps across Noah's entire body. "Tyler?" he hissed, reaching over to shake his friend. "Tyler, wake up." Tyler groaned and rolled over. "What? Do you hear that?" Tyler was silent for a moment, listening. "Hear what?" "The voices, the whispering." "I do not hear anything, man. Go back to sleep." But Noah could hear them clearly, surrounding the tent, moving in a circle. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent. And then he saw the fire. Through the mesh window of the tent, he could see the dead campfire pit. Except it was no longer dead. Flames roared up from it, easily 3 feet high, burning with an unnatural blue-white light that cast dancing shadows across the clearing. The fire made no sound. It simply burned impossibly, fed by nothing but the ashes they had left hours before. "Tyler!" Noah grabbed his friend's arm. "Look at the fire!" Tyler sat up, following Noah's pointing finger. His eyes went wide as he saw the flames. What the hell? The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse. Complete silence. Not even the wind moved. The blue flames continued their silent dance, illuminating the clearing in ghostly light. And in that light, Noah saw that they were not alone. Figures stood in a circle around the fire. 7 or 8 of them, maybe more, all wearing the same rough work clothes, all impossibly thin, all standing in that same unnatural stillness. Their faces were in shadow, but Noah could feel their attention, focused entirely on the tents. In the tent beside theirs, Marcus and Brandon were awake now too, their voices raised in confusion and fear. All 4 of them saw the same thing, the impossible fire and the silent watchers surrounding it, Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fire roared even higher, a pillar of blue flame reaching toward the sky. The heat should have been unbearable at that distance, but Noah felt nothing. The figures remained motionless around the inferno, and for just a moment, Noah thought he could see their faces in the blue light. Hollow eyes, mouths open in silent screams, expressions of rage and sorrow mixed together. Brandon screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of pure terror. The moment the scream echoed across the clearing, the fire vanished. Not died down, but vanished completely, as if it had never existed. The figures were gone. The clearing was dark and empty again. All four of them erupted from their tents simultaneously, stumbling into each other in the darkness, all talking at once, all confirming they had seen the same impossible thing. Marcus tried his flashlight, which worked perfectly. The fire pit contained only cold ashes. But when they examined the ground around the fire, they found something that made Noah's blood run cold. The tent stakes had been pulled up, not by wind or animals, but deliberately removed and placed in a perfect circle around the fire pit, evenly spaced, driven into the ground in a pattern that could not have been accidental. None of them had done this. They had all been in their tents. Their food bags, hung carefully from a tree branch to avoid attracting bears, had been taken down and emptied. The contents were scattered across the clearing in what might have been random chaos. But Noah noticed that nothing had been eaten. The food was simply distributed, as if someone had been searching through it and then discarded everything. They stood in a tight group in the center of the clearing, playing their flashlights in every direction, seeing nothing but feeling watched by hostile presences just beyond the reach of the light. None of them suggested staying until morning. Without discussion, they began breaking down their camp with frantic speed, stuffing gear into packs without any attempt at organization, wanting only to get away from that place. They were on the trail within 20 minutes, hiking by flashlight, stumbling over roots and rocks in their haste, but not caring. The 2 miles back to the parking area felt like 10. Every sound in the dark forest made them jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a watching figure. When they finally reached the cars and the comforting presence of the paved parking area, they sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what they had experienced. As the adrenaline began to fade, Marcus pulled out his phone and started searching for information about the mining disaster. What he found confirmed their worst fears. The collapse had occurred on November 3rd, 1887. 14 men had been working deep in the mine when a support timber failed, triggering a cascading collapse that sealed them in. Rescue efforts lasted 4 days, but the instability of the remaining structure made it impossible to reach the trapped miners. On the 4th day, another collapse killed 2 would-be rescuers, and the operation was abandoned. The 14 men were left where they died, their bodies still entombed in the mountain. Marcus looked up from his phone, his face pale. "Guys, today is November 3rd. The coincidence was too exact to ignore. They had camped on the anniversary of the disaster, on the ground where those 14 men had lived and worked, and they had been visited by something that wanted them gone. Further research over the following days revealed more. The mining settlement had a reputation among locals. People who camped near the ruins reported feeling unwelcome, experiencing unexplained phenomena, and sometimes fleeing in the middle of the night. There were stories going back decades of mysterious fires, whispered voices, and thin figures seen standing among the ruins. The common thread in all the accounts was rage, a palpable anger directed at anyone who intruded on that space. The historical records provided a possible explanation. The miners who died had been recent immigrants, mostly from Eastern Europe, lured to America with promises of good wages and steady work. They had left families behind, planning to send for them once they were established. When they died, their bodies were never sent home, never given proper burials according to their traditions. They were simply sealed in the mountain and forgotten as the town emptied out and nature reclaimed the site. Noah found himself wondering if the bartender's warning about the land being watched over was more accurate than she knew. Perhaps those 14 men, or whatever remained of their consciousness, still walked the ruins of Harwick. Perhaps they resented the intrusion of strangers into the place of their death, especially on the anniversary of their tragedy. He never returned to those mountains. None of them did. Tyler changed schools the following semester, wanting to put distance between himself and the experience. Marcus deleted all the photos from that night and stopped his local history project. Brandon started seeing a therapist to deal with nightmares that persisted for months. Noah still thinks about that night, about the impossible fire and the figures standing in silent vigil around it. He had been a skeptic, someone who demanded rational explanations for every phenomenon. But there is no rational explanation for what they experienced. Something was in that clearing with them, something that defied every natural law he understood. He does not talk about it much anymore. When he does, people assume he is embellishing, turning a scary camping trip into a ghost story. But he knows what he saw. He knows what they all saw. And he knows that some places are marked by tragedy so deep that it echoes across generations, refusing to be forgotten, demanding recognition from anyone foolish enough to intrude on ground that has been consecrated by blood and suffering. The mountains of Appalachia hold many secrets, and some of those secrets do not want to be disturbed. Ethan needed to get away from everything. The breakup with Amanda had been brutal, the kind that leaves you questioning every decision you made over the past 3 years. He could not stand being in the apartment they had shared, surrounded by reminders of what had fallen apart. His friends meant well with their offers to go out drinking or their attempts at distraction, but Ethan needed something different. He needed silence, solitude, and the clarity that only nature could provide. He chose the Pacific Northwest specifically because of its reputation for old-growth forests. He wanted to be surrounded by something ancient, something that existed long before his problems and would continue long after. He researched for days before settling on a remote area in the Olympic Peninsula, a region known for massive Douglas firs and limited human traffic. The forecast showed clear weather for the weekend, and Ethan loaded his truck with camping gear on a Friday afternoon in late October. The drive took longer than expected, the roads narrowing progressively until he found himself on a gravel logging road that barely qualified as a road at all. His truck bounced over ruts and rocks for nearly an hour before he reached the trailhead, which consisted of nothing more than a small clearing where the road ended. There were no other vehicles, no signs indicating trail names or distances. Just a narrow path disappearing into the massive trees. Ethan shouldered his pack now and started walking. The forest was stunning in its scale. The trees rose like cathedral columns, their trunks wider than he could wrap his arms around, their canopy so dense that the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. Ferns grew everywhere in the dim light, creating a lush carpet of green. The air smelled of moss and decay, the rich scent of a living ecosystem. He hiked for nearly 2 hours before finding what he was looking for. A clearing opened beside a clear stream, the water running over smooth stones with a gentle music that immediately soothed his frayed nerves. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet across, carpeted with soft grass and surrounded by the towering trees. Sunlight actually reached the ground here, filtered through the canopy in golden shafts that gave the space an almost sacred quality. Ethan dropped his pack and began setting up camp. He was pitching his tent when he noticed the first carving. It was on a massive fir at the edge of the clearing, cut deep into the bark, maybe 5 feet off the ground. The symbol was unfamiliar, a series of intersecting lines forming a pattern that looked almost like a stylized eye. Ethan walked closer, running his fingers over the carving. It was not fresh, but it was not ancient either. The exposed wood had weathered, but not yet grayed completely. He estimated it was perhaps a year or two old. Curious, he walked the perimeter of the clearing and found more symbols. They were on different trees, all at roughly the same height, all carved with similar depth and precision. Some matched the first eye-like symbol. Others were different, more abstract patterns that might have been letters in some alphabet he did not recognize. Together, they seemed to form a rough circle around the clearing. Ethan felt a small chill of unease, but dismissed it. Probably some local kids or maybe hikers who fancied themselves amateur pagans. People carved all kinds of things in remote places. It did not mean anything. He finished setting up camp and spent the remainder of the afternoon trying to read. But his mind kept drifting back to Amanda and the increasingly bitter final months of their relationship. As darkness fell, he cooked a simple meal over his camp stove and watched the stars emerge through breaks in the canopy. Around 10 o'clock, he heard the drumming. It was distant at first, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to come from deeper in the forest. Ethan sat up from where he had been lying by his fire, listening intently. The rhythm was steady, multiple drums playing in coordination. And there were voices too, faint but audible, rising and falling in what sounded like a chant. His first thought was that there must be another camping group nearby, though he had seen no evidence of other people, and the sound seemed to be coming from quite a distance. He listened for several minutes as the drumming continued. It was growing gradually louder, or perhaps closer. The chanting became more distinct, though he could not make out any words. Then he saw the lights. They appeared between the trees, bobbing and weaving like lanterns carried by people walking in procession. Ethan stood, his heart beginning to beat faster. The lights were approaching the clearing, following what must have been a trail he had not noticed. The drumming was loud now, clearly audible over the sound of the stream. He watched, frozen in place, as the procession emerged into his clearing. There were perhaps 15 people, moving in a single file line. Each wore a mask, carved wooden faces representing various animals. He recognized a bear, a wolf, an owl, and others he could not immediately identify. The masks were crude but striking, painted in earth tones and adorned with feathers and fur. The people wore long cloaks made of what looked like burlap or rough wool, hooded and shapeless. Several carried drums, beating out that hypnotic rhythm. Others held torches, the flames casting wild shadows across the clearing. They moved as if Ethan was not there. The procession entered the clearing and began to form a circle, the participants arranging themselves with practiced precision. They were chanting in unison now, words in a language Ethan did not recognize. It might have been Native American, though it did not quite sound like any indigenous language he had heard before. There was something older about it, more guttural. Ethan stood beside his tent, less than 20 feet from the circle, completely visible in the firelight. But none of them looked at him. They continued their ritual, focused entirely on whatever ceremony they were performing. One figure stepped into the center of the circle. This person wore a stag mask, more elaborate than the others, with real antlers attached to the wooden face. The stag-masked figure held something in both hands, lifting it toward the sky. Ethan could see it was a dead crow, arranged with flowers and what might have been herbs. The chanting reached a crescendo. The stag-masked figure placed the crow carefully on the ground in the exact center of the circle. The others began to move around it, dancing in a slow rotation while maintaining their chant. The drumming changed tempo, becoming faster, more urgent. Ethan knew he should feel scared, but the emotion that dominated was confusion. This was clearly some kind of ritual, performed with serious intent. But why here? Why on this specific night? And why were they acting as if his presence was completely irrelevant? The dance continued for several minutes. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The chanting ceased. The drums fell silent. Every masked figure stood perfectly still in the sudden quiet. The stag-masked leader turned and looked directly at Ethan. Even through the wooden mask, even with the eye holes showing nothing but shadow, Ethan felt the weight of that gaze. It was not curiosity or surprise. It was something else, something that made his blood run cold. Recognition, perhaps, or judgment. The stag-masked figure raised one arm and pointed directly at him. The others turned in unison, all of their animal faces now oriented toward Ethan. No one spoke. No one moved except to maintain that pointing gesture. 15 arms extended toward where he stood beside his tent. Terror finally broke through Ethan's paralysis. He did not grab his gear or his food or anything except his phone and keys from the tent. He ran. He crashed into the forest, no longer on any trail, just running in what he hoped was the general direction of his truck. Branches whipped at his face. He stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind him, he heard nothing. No pursuit, no shouts, just the terrible silence of those masked figures. He ran for what felt like hours, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. Several times he fell, picking himself up and continuing without pause. Terror gave him strength beyond what he knew he possessed. When he finally stumbled onto the logging road, he nearly collapsed with relief. His truck was still there, untouched. He fumbled with his keys, got the door open, and locked himself inside. Only then did he allow himself to look back toward the forest. The trees stood dark and silent. No lights, no sounds. Nothing to indicate anyone else was out there. Ethan started the truck and drove, not caring about the rough road, bouncing violently over ruts he had navigated carefully on the way in. He did not slow down until he reached paved highway. 30 minutes later, he spent the rest of the night in a motel room, doors locked, curtains drawn. When morning came, he called the county sheriff and reported what he had seen. The deputy who took his statement was polite but skeptical. There were no organized groups known to perform ceremonies in that area. No permits had been issued for gatherings. When Ethan insisted, the deputy promised to send someone to check the site. 3 days later, Ethan received a call. Rangers had hiked to the clearing he described. They found his tent, his gear, everything exactly as he had left it. But there was no evidence of any other people. No trampled grass where a circle had formed. No remains of the dead crow, no footprints other than his own. However, they did find something that made Ethan's hands shake when they described it. The symbols he had seen carved into the trees had been burned into the ground. Not carved, not painted, but burned deep into the earth in a perfect circle where his tent had stood. The grass inside the circle was completely dead, as if the ground itself had been poisoned. The Rangers had no explanation. They confiscated his gear as evidence in an ongoing investigation, though Ethan never learned what they were investigating or what conclusions they reached. He researched the area obsessively for weeks after, looking for any reference to rituals or ceremonies or groups that might wear animal masks. He found mentions in obscure forums of the old ceremonies, practices that supposedly predated European contact, kept alive by families who never abandoned the traditions even as the world modernized around them. Some posts suggested these groups were protective of certain places, performing rituals to maintain spiritual boundaries. Whether that was true or just internet folklore, Ethan never learned. What he knew with certainty was that he had intruded on something he was never meant to witness, and those masked figures had marked him in some way. The burned circle where his tent had stood felt like a warning or perhaps a curse. He never went solo camping again. Some clearings, no matter how beautiful, are reserved for purposes beyond the understanding of those who do not belong there. Mason had been backpacking for nearly 15 years, accumulating enough experience to feel confident in even the most remote wilderness areas. He prided himself on thorough preparation, physical fitness, and the kind of calm judgment that kept people safe in environments where mistakes could be fatal. When he decided to spend a long weekend exploring the slot canyons of southern Utah, he approached it with his usual methodical planning. He researched routes, checked weather forecasts, packed appropriate gear, and filed a detailed itinerary with his roommate. Everything was done properly, by the book. The canyon he chose was called Serpent's Throat, a narrow passage carved through red sandstone over millions of years by water that now appeared only during flash floods. It was not on the standard tourist circuit. Access required hiking several miles across exposed desert, followed by a technical descent into the canyon system. According to the hiking forums Mason consulted, fewer than 100 people visited Serpent's Throat each year. That isolation was exactly what appealed to him. He arrived at the trailhead on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September. The temperature was still brutal, the kind of dry heat that sucked moisture from exposed skin within minutes. Mason started the approach hike in the late afternoon, planning to reach the canyon entrance around sunset, when the temperatures would become more manageable. The desert landscape was stark and beautiful, all red rock and sparse vegetation under an impossibly blue sky. The descent into the canyon required careful navigation down a series of natural ledges, and one section where he used a rope he had anchored at the rim. Once inside the canyon system, the temperature dropped noticeably. The walls rose perhaps 80 feet on either side, so narrow in places that Mason could touch both walls simultaneously. The rock was striated in shades of red and orange, polished smooth by ancient floods. The acoustics were remarkable. Every footstep echoed, every breath seemed amplified. Mason hiked deeper into the canyon as twilight turned to darkness overhead. He used his headlamp to navigate, though the canyon was so narrow that he could only move forward or backward. There were no side passages here, no places to get genuinely lost. That simplicity was part of the appeal. He found his intended campsite about 2 miles into the canyon. The passage widened slightly here, creating a space perhaps 15 feet across. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the walls, geometric patterns and animal figures pecked into the rock by people who had occupied this landscape centuries before Europeans arrived. Mason had researched these carvings specifically. They were ancestral Puebloan, probably created between 800 and 1200 years ago. He set up his sleeping pad and bag on the sandy canyon floor, ate a cold dinner, and settled in to read by headlamp. The silence was profound. No wind reached the canyon floor. No animals seemed to live in this harsh environment. Just Mason and the ancient rock and the vastness of the desert night above. Around 10 o'clock, he heard his name. Mason. The voice was his own. Same tone, same inflection, but he had not spoken. He sat up quickly, shining his headlamp down the canyon in the direction the sound had come from. The beam illuminated only empty passage, the walls narrowing into shadow perhaps 30 feet away. He listened intently. Nothing. Perhaps it had been an auditory hallucination, his tired mind playing tricks. Or maybe an echo of some sound he had made without realizing it, reflected strangely by the canyon walls. Then it came again. Mason. Closer this time. And there was no question now. It was his voice calling his name from deeper in the canyon. The same voice he heard recorded on videos, the voice he had never quite gotten used to hearing played back, because it sounded different from how he heard it inside his own head. He stood up, heart beginning to race. Hello? His greeting echoed naturally, bouncing off the walls in a diminishing series. But there was no answer from whatever had called his name. Mason considered his options. He could pack up and attempt to retreat back to the canyon entrance in the darkness. Or he could investigate, try to determine what was making the sound. His rational mind insisted there must be an explanation. Perhaps another hiker was in the canyon, someone with a similar voice. Perhaps there was some bizarre acoustic phenomenon he did not understand. He grabbed his headlamp and started walking deeper into Serpent's Throat. The canyon narrowed further, the walls closing in until he had to turn sideways in places to squeeze through. His headlamp beam showed only rock and more rock, passage stretching ahead with no sign of any other person. He called out several more times, and each time his voice echoed normally with no response. Then he saw the camp. It was set up in a small widening of the canyon, perhaps a quarter-mile beyond where Mason had established his own site. A sleeping bag, a backpack, scattered items of gear, a water bottle sitting upright on a flat rock. Everything looked recent, not abandoned for days or weeks, but actively in use. Mason approached cautiously. Hello? Anyone here? No answer. He knelt beside the backpack, shining his light on it. The pack was a Gregory model, forest green, well used but maintained. Attached to it was a small journal, the kind backpackers often carried to record their routes and observations. Mason opened the journal, feeling only slightly guilty about invading someone's privacy. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dated entries describing a solo backpacking trip through the Utah canyons. He flipped to the most recent entry and felt his blood turn to ice. The entry was dated today, September 19th, and the writer's name, written at the top of the page, was MC Mason Carter, his name. He flipped back through the journal with shaking hands. The entries described the exact trip he was on. Same arrival date, same approach hike, same descent into Serpent's Throat. The observations matched perfectly. A description of the petroglyphs. Notes about the temperature differential between the desert rim and the canyon floor. Even a comment about how the acoustics made every sound echo strangely. But these entries were dated 3 weeks earlier, August 29th through September 1st. The final entry was short. I hear myself calling. I am going to see who it is. Mason dropped the journal as if it had burned him. He backed away from the campsite, his mind reeling. This was not possible. This violated every natural law he understood. But the evidence was there in his hands, written in handwriting that looked disturbingly similar to his own. He turned to retreat to his camp and found it was gone. The canyon section where he knew he had set up his sleeping bag was empty. He ran to the spot, playing his headlamp across the sand. No sleeping bag, no pad, no pack. Everything had vanished. But there were footprints in the sand, multiple overlapping tracks from boots that looked exactly like the ones he was wearing. Mason spun in a circle, breathing hard, trying to understand what was happening. Then he saw his pack. It was sitting against the canyon wall, exactly where the other pack had been in the camp he had just found. He approached it slowly and saw the journal attached to it. His journal, the one he carried on every backpacking trip. With trembling hands, he opened it to the last entry. His own handwriting filled the page. The entry was dated September 1st, 3 weeks ago. It described his trip, including a note about hearing his own voice calling from deeper in the canyon. The final line read, "I found another camp. Same gear, same pack. Journal dated 6 months earlier. What is this place?" Mason turned the page. The next entry was in the same handwriting, but different ink, as if written with a different pen. It was dated 6 months earlier, March 15th. It described the same trip, same canyon, same experience of hearing one's own voice, same discovery of a previous camp. He flipped forward through the journal. There were more entries, dozens of them, all in the same handwriting, stretching back over what appeared to be years. Each one described the same trip. Each one ended with the discovery of an earlier camp. Each one expressed growing confusion and fear. The most recent entry, dated today, September 19th, was only one sentence. "The canyon is a loop. Time here folds back on itself. I think I have been here before. I think I will always be here." Mason felt his sanity beginning to crack. He looked up at the narrow strip of night sky visible between the canyon walls. The stars looked wrong somehow, their position subtly off from what they should be. Or perhaps his perception had shifted. Perhaps he was no longer occupying the same moment he thought he was. He ran, not deeper into the canyon and not back toward the entrance, but laterally, scrambling up the canyon wall in a desperate attempt to escape the passage floor. The sandstone was too smooth, too steep. He fell twice, skinning his hands and knees. On the third attempt, he managed to climb perhaps 20 feet before the handholds disappeared and he was forced to descend. When he returned to the canyon floor, he found himself at another camp. This one had his gear, but the arrangement was different. The sleeping bag was unrolled, the pack was open, and sitting on a flat rock was a water bottle he recognized as his own, positioned exactly as it had been in the first camp he had found. He checked the journal again. Now it had more entries, extending further into what appeared to be the future. September 20th, September 21st, each one describing attempts to escape the canyon. Each one failing, each one ending with the same realization that the passage was a closed loop, a place where time did not flow linearly, but circled back on itself endlessly. Mason never made it out of Serpent's Throat Canyon. When rangers found his camp 6 weeks later, alerted by his roommate after he failed to return as scheduled, his gear was arranged in a neat pile. His journal was open to a page dated 2 years in the future, filled with handwriting that matched the earlier entries but had degraded into barely legible scrawl. The final entry was just one word repeated dozens of times. Echoes. The canyon has been unofficially closed since then. Not by any official decree, but by quiet recommendation from rangers who know its reputation. 7 hikers have vanished in Serpent's Throat since 1970. Their gear is always found, arranged with eerie precision. Journals open to entries describing trips that occurred weeks or months before their actual arrival dates. Indigenous groups who have lived near the canyon for generations say it is a place where time folds, where the past and future exist simultaneously. They avoid it, considering the passage sacred and dangerous in equal measure. They say some places exist outside the normal flow of reality, and that people who enter such places may find themselves trapped in moments that repeat infinitely, forever searching for an exit that exists always just ahead and always just behind, never quite reachable, never quite real. Lucas had been struggling with writer's block for nearly 6 months. His debut novel had done moderately well enough to secure a 2-book contract with his publisher. But the second book refused to materialize. He would sit at his laptop for hours, staring at a blank screen, the cursor blinking mockingly at him. His editor was patient but persistent, and the deadline was approaching with terrifying speed. Lucas needed a change of environment, something drastic enough to shake loose whatever was blocking his creative process. He found the cabin listing on a remote rental website. It was located on a small lake in the Canadian wilderness, accessible only by boat, with no neighbors for miles. The listing emphasized complete isolation. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. Just a well-maintained cabin with a wood stove, propane lighting, and stunning views. The owner offered discounted rates for extended stays. Lucas booked it for 2 weeks without hesitation. The float plane that took him to the cabin was a tiny 4-seater piloted by a weathered man in his 60s who made small talk about fishing and weather patterns. He dropped Lucas at a wooden dock that extended from the cabin's rocky shoreline, helped unload his supplies, and handed him a satellite phone for emergencies. "You got enough food for 2 weeks?" the pilot asked, eyeing Lucas's collection of boxes and bags. "More than enough," Lucas confirmed. "Good. I will be back on the 23rd unless you call sooner. Weather permitting, of course." The pilot paused, looking at the cabin and then back at Lucas. "You staying here alone?" "That is the plan." The pilot nodded slowly. "Some folks find it gets too quiet after a few days. The isolation can mess with your head if you are not used to it. You got that sat phone. Do not be shy about using it if you need out early." Lucas thanked him and watched the plane taxi across the glassy water before lifting off and disappearing over the tree line. The silence that followed was profound. No traffic, no voices, no background hum of modern life. Just water lapping against the dock and wind moving through the pines. The cabin was exactly as advertised. One large room with a sleeping area, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a desk positioned by a window overlooking the lake. The walls were decorated with mounted fish and old photographs of previous visitors holding impressive catches. Lucas unpacked his supplies, set up his laptop, and made himself dinner as the sun set behind the western ridge. That first night, he slept deeply and woke feeling more refreshed than he had in months. He spent the morning exploring the immediate area around the cabin, then settled at the desk after lunch to write. The words came easily, flowing in a way they had not in half a year. By evening, he had produced nearly 3,000 words of usable material. He felt elated. The pattern continued for 4 days. Wake, write, eat, explore, write more, sleep. Lucas fell into a rhythm that felt almost meditative. He fished from the dock in the late afternoons, catching enough trout for dinner. He watched loons diving in the lake's center. He sat by the wood stove in the evenings, reading by lamplight and feeling content in a way he had forgotten was possible. On the 5th morning, he woke to find his canoe had been moved. He knew he had pulled it fully onto the rocky beach the previous evening, securing it well above the waterline. But now it sat at the water's edge, turned upside down as if someone had intentionally flipped it. Lucas walked around the canoe slowly, looking for signs of animal activity or some natural explanation. The beach showed no tracks other than his own footprints from the previous day. He flipped the canoe back over and returned it to its proper position, dismissing the incident as something he must have misremembered. Perhaps he had not secured it as well as he thought. The wind might have caught it somehow. But over the next few days, other things began to happen. He would wake to find his coffee mug on a different counter than where he had left it the night before. The wood stove poker would be leaning against the opposite wall. Pages of his manuscript would be rearranged on the desk, shuffled into a different order than he had left them. Each incident was small, easy to rationalize as his own forgetfulness. He was alone in the wilderness, after all, with no routine and no external structure. Perhaps he was simply becoming absent-minded. On day 8, Lucas decided to test his theory. Before going to bed, he arranged items in very specific positions. He placed his coffee mug in the exact center of the kitchen table. He stacked 3 books on the desk in a precise order and photographed them with his phone. He positioned the canoe paddle across the doorway at an angle, balancing it carefully so it would fall if the door opened. He woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of the paddle clattering to the floor. Lucas sat up in bed, heart racing, peering into the darkness of the cabin. The paddle lay on the floor. The door was closed. He turned on his headlamp and checked the room. The coffee mug was now sitting on the counter beside the sink. The 3 books had been rearranged in reverse order. He was alone. Every door and window was closed and latched from the inside. There was no one else in the cabin, yet someone or something had moved these objects while he slept. Lucas barely slept the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, he checked the photographs on his phone to confirm he had not dreamed the arrangement of items. The photos showed exactly what he remembered. Someone was moving things, but who and how? He spent the day watching the cabin nervously, but nothing happened during daylight hours. That evening, he set up his phone to record video overnight, positioning it on a shelf with a view of most of the room. He went to bed tense and alert, lying awake for hours before exhaustion finally pulled him under. He woke at sunrise and immediately checked the phone. The video had recorded 8 hours of footage. Lucas fast-forwarded through most of it, watching the empty room remain empty. Then, at the 3-hour mark, something happened. A figure rose from his bed. It took Lucas a moment to realize he was looking at himself. The video showed him getting up, walking mechanically to the kitchen, moving the coffee mug, walking to the desk, rearranging papers, then returning to bed. His movements were stiff and unnatural, like a sleepwalker or someone being remotely controlled. His face, when it briefly turned toward the camera, was completely blank. No expression, no awareness, just empty features. Lucas watched the video 3 more times, his hands shaking. He had no memory of any of this. None. He had been deeply asleep, or so he thought. Yet here was proof that he had been moving around the cabin, rearranging things, doing it all while apparently unconscious. That night, he forced himself to watch the video recording again. This time, he noticed something even more disturbing. At one point, his sleepwalking self stopped in front of the camera and stood there for nearly 5 minutes, staring directly into the lens. The expression on his face was not quite blank anymore. There was something behind the eyes, some presence that was not quite him. Over the next 3 nights, the pattern continued. Each night, the video showed him rising at approximately 3 in the morning, moving through the cabin, rearranging objects, sometimes sitting at the desk and typing on his laptop. He checked what had been typed and found pages of text he did not remember writing. The content was disturbing, descriptions of events at the lake that had not happened yet, but were written as if they already had. A drowning, a disappearance, a body found on the rocky shore. On day 12, Lucas decided he had to search the cabin thoroughly. He pulled out drawers, looked behind furniture, checked under the floorboards. In a hidden compartment built into the wall behind a mounted fish, he found a stack of journals. They were written by previous renters of the cabin, spanning what appeared to be several years. Lucas read through them with growing horror. Every person described the same experience. Items moving during the night, a feeling of being watched, and eventually, the discovery that they were getting up and moving around while apparently asleep. One journal entry, dated 5 years earlier, stood out. The lake does not want anyone to leave. It gets into your head somehow, makes you do things. I tried to pack up and go today, but found myself unpacking everything an hour later with no memory of doing it. Called for early pickup, but then called back and canceled. I do not remember making that second call. I need help. The journal ended there. Lucas checked the name written inside the front cover and searched for it on his phone. The signal was weak, but functional enough for a basic search. He found an obituary. The man had drowned in a Canadian lake 6 weeks after that final journal entry. The death was ruled accidental. Lucas found similar patterns in other journals. People staying too long, people acting strangely. Some of the journals ended with entries dated weeks after the person had supposedly left. One journal contained entries extending 2 months beyond the writer's planned departure date, becoming increasingly incoherent, the handwriting degrading into barely legible scrawl. That night, Lucas did not sleep. He sat in a chair facing the door, holding the satellite phone, watching the clock. At 3 in the morning exactly, he felt it. A pressure in his head, gentle but insistent, suggesting he stand up, walk to the bed, lie down, sleep. He fought it, gripping the arms of the chair, forcing himself to stay alert. The pressure increased, becoming painful, his vision blurred. He raised the sat phone and pressed the emergency button before the darkness took him. He woke on the dock in the morning sunlight, his feet in the water, no memory of how he had gotten there. The satellite phone was gone. The float plane arrived that afternoon, summoned by his emergency call. The pilot found Lucas sitting on the dock, staring at the water, clutching his manuscript. On the flight back, Lucas reviewed what he had written during his stay. The novel was complete, every chapter finished, including sections he had no memory of writing. The quality was excellent, perhaps the best work he had ever produced. But the final chapters described events he had not experienced. Scenes set at the lake involving a character very much like himself, slowly losing his grip on reality, becoming part of the lake itself. His consciousness absorbed into something ancient that lived in the water and the forest and the cabin. Lucas burned the manuscript the day he got home. He never published the second novel. He never wrote again. Some stories, he decided, are not meant to be told, and some places extract a price for their inspiration that is far too high to pay. Jack had been looking forward to the camping trip for weeks. His younger brother Danny was 13, at that awkward age where he was trying to act older than he was, desperate to be treated like an adult rather than a kid. Their parents had split up the previous year, and Jack, now 22 and working his first real job, wanted to do something to maintain their relationship. A weekend camping trip seemed perfect. Low pressure, time to talk or not talk as they chose, and a chance to get away from the constant tension that still lingered whenever they visited their mother's house. They chose a state park campground about 2 hours from home. It was popular enough to feel safe, with rangers patrolling regularly and families scattered throughout the loops of campsites. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in mid-July, the peak of camping season. The campground was nearly full, RVs and tents occupying most of the numbered sites. Kids rode bikes along the paved roads. The smell of grilling meat drifted from multiple directions. It was exactly the wholesome family atmosphere Jack had hoped for. They set up their tent at Site 47, a spot with decent tree cover and close proximity to the bathrooms. That proximity seemed like a convenience at first. Danny could walk to the restrooms without Jack worrying about him getting lost in the dark. It was only 100 yards or so, easily visible from their campsite. After setting up, they explored the area. The campground had a small beach on a lake, a playground, and several hiking trails. They swam for an hour, the cold water a relief from the July heat, then returned to their site to start dinner. Jack grilled hot dogs while Danny attempted to build a campfire using techniques he had learned from YouTube videos. It was a good evening, comfortable and easy in a way their interactions had not been since the divorce. As darkness fell, they sat by the fire, and Danny talked about school, his friends, a girl he maybe liked but was not sure about. Jack listened and offered what he hoped was decent advice, feeling oddly adult and responsible. Around 10 o'clock, Danny announced he needed to use the bathroom. Jack watched him walk down the gravel path toward the brick building that housed the restrooms, his brother's silhouette visible in the glow of the campground's sparse lighting. That was when Jack noticed the man. He was sitting in a folding chair at the campsite directly adjacent to theirs, Site 48. Jack had not paid much attention to the site earlier. There had been a sedan parked there, nothing remarkable, no tent visible. Now he saw the man clearly, illuminated by a small, battery-powered lantern. He was middle-aged, perhaps 50, wearing khaki cargo shorts and a faded t-shirt. He had no book, no phone, no apparent activity. He was simply sitting in his chair, facing toward the bathroom building, watching. Jack felt a small stirring of unease, but dismissed it. Maybe the guy was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just relaxing and had happened to face that direction. Still, something about the stillness of the man's posture bothered him. Danny returned from the bathroom, and they talked for another hour before deciding to turn in. As they crawled into the tent, Jack glanced over at Site 48. The man was still sitting there in exactly the same position, still facing the bathrooms. Jack woke sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of Danny unzipping the tent. His brother whispered that he needed to pee again. Jack mumbled acknowledgement and checked his phone. It was 2:30 in the morning. The campground was silent, except for the distant call of an owl and the rustling of something small in the underbrush. Danny left the tent, and Jack lay there in the darkness, too awake now to fall back asleep immediately. He heard Danny's footsteps on the gravel path, moving away from the tent toward the bathrooms. Then he heard other footsteps. They were heavier, more deliberate, following the same path Danny had taken. Jack sat up, suddenly fully alert. He unzipped the tent mesh window and peered out into the darkness. The man from Site 48 was walking toward the bathrooms, following Danny. The same man, still wearing the same clothes, moving with purpose through the darkness. He had no flashlight, but the campground's security lights provided enough illumination to see by. Jack's protective instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of the tent, not bothering with shoes. He followed the man, keeping a distance of perhaps 50 feet. The man reached the bathroom building and stopped outside, not entering, just standing near the entrance in the shadows, where the security light did not quite reach. Jack approached quickly, making no attempt to be quiet. The man heard him coming and turned, his face neutral in the dim light. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his voice harder than he intended. "Just using the facilities," the man replied. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Then why are you standing out here?" "Waiting my turn." The man's eyes flicked toward the bathroom entrance, then back to Jack. Jack positioned himself between the man and the door. "My brother's in there. I will wait with you." For a long moment, the man said nothing. They stood in uncomfortable silence, at Jack's heart pounding, the man's expression unreadable. Then Danny emerged from the bathroom, looking confused to find Jack standing there. "Everything okay?" Danny asked. "Yeah, just needed some air. Let us head back." Jack kept himself between Danny and the stranger as they walked back to their campsite. He looked back once and saw the man still standing there, not moving, not entering the bathroom, just watching them leave. Jack did not sleep the rest of the night. He sat in the tent entrance, watching Site 48. The man returned to his chair and resumed his vigil, facing the bathrooms. At one point, another child, a boy of maybe 9 or 10 from a nearby campsite, walked to the restrooms alone. The man stood up and began walking in the same direction. But the boy's father appeared moments later, clearly having followed his son. And the stranger stopped, turned around, and returned to his chair. As soon as the sun rose and the ranger station opened, Jack left Danny at the campsite and walked to the main office. He told the ranger on duty everything he had observed: the man's constant watching, the way he had followed Danny, the incident with the other child, the complete lack of camping gear at his site. The ranger's expression grew serious. She radioed for backup, and within minutes, 2 additional rangers arrived. They approached Site 48 together, while Jack watched from a distance. The man was cooperative, but evasive. He claimed he was camping, though he had no tent or visible gear except the chair and lantern. When rangers checked his vehicle, they found restraints, zip ties, and a tarp in the trunk. They also found a notebook containing descriptions of various state park campgrounds, notes about bathroom locations, typical visitor patterns, and times when children were most likely to be alone. The rangers detained him and called local police. Jack gave a full statement. So did the father of the other boy, who confirmed he had noticed the man watching his son and had felt uncomfortable enough to follow him to the bathroom. Police ran the man's information and discovered he was a registered sex offender with convictions related to child exploitation. He had been banned from 3 other state parks in neighboring counties for similar behavior: camping without actual camping equipment and positioning himself near bathroom facilities frequented by children. A detective called Jack 2 days later with an update. The man, whose name was Roger Kessler, was being held on multiple violations of his parole conditions. Further investigation revealed he had been systematically visiting state park campgrounds throughout the region, never staying more than 1 night at each location, always choosing sites near bathrooms, always watching. The detective's voice was grave as he told Jack how close they had come to a tragedy. Kessler had been a suspect in a child abduction case from another state 5 years earlier. A 9-year-old boy had disappeared from a campground bathroom. The child's body was never found. There was no physical evidence linking Kessler to the crime, but the circumstances matched his known patterns perfectly. "You did the right thing," the detective said. "Following your instincts, intervening, reporting it immediately. A lot of people would have talked themselves out of it, worried about seeming paranoid or causing a scene. Your brother is lucky to have you looking out for him." Jack hung up the phone, feeling shaken. He thought about how easily it could have gone differently. If he had not been paying attention, if he had dismissed his unease as paranoia, if Danny had gone to the bathroom alone earlier in the evening when Jack was distracted by setting up camp. The man had been watching, waiting for an opportunity. And Jack had arrived at that campground by pure chance, placing his brother directly in a predator's field of vision. Danny did not fully understand the danger he had been in until Jack explained it carefully, omitting the worst details, but making sure his brother understood why it was important to always be aware of surroundings, to trust his instincts about people who made him uncomfortable. and to never go anywhere isolated alone in public spaces. They never returned to that campground. Jack chose different locations for their subsequent camping trips, always checking the layout of bathroom facilities, always choosing sites where Danny would be visible the entire walk. The innocence of those family campgrounds had been permanently tainted by the knowledge of what could hide in plain sight. Predators who blended seamlessly into the wholesome atmosphere, waiting patiently for children to wander just far enough from safety. The case against Kessler expanded as more evidence was collected. Investigators found digital files on his laptop containing surveillance photos from dozens of campgrounds, images of children taken without their knowledge or their parents' consent. The notebook in his car revealed years of methodical planning, studying the patterns of families, identifying vulnerabilities in campground security, perfecting the appearance of a harmless middle-aged camper who attracted no suspicion. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison on multiple charges. But the detective privately told Jack that they believed Kessler had successfully abducted at least 2 children over the years, though they could not prove it conclusively. Those families would never have closure. Those children were simply gone, vanished from campground bathrooms while their parents sat 100 yards away, believing their children were safe in a supervised public area. Jack thinks about that often. How safety is an illusion we construct to make the world feel manageable. How predators understand that illusion and exploit it, positioning themselves in the spaces where we have let our guard down. How a camping trip, that quintessential wholesome family activity, can become a hunting ground for those who prey on the vulnerable. He still camps with Danny, but the experience is forever changed. He never relaxes completely. He always watches. And when he sees someone sitting alone at a campsite with no gear, facing the bathrooms with that peculiar stillness that suggests waiting rather than resting, he calls the Rangers immediately. Because he knows now that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look utterly ordinary, sitting patiently in plain sight, counting on everyone's reluctance to acknowledge that such evil could exist in such wholesome surroundings. Henry had been guiding wilderness treks for nearly 12 years, accumulating enough experience to handle almost any situation the backcountry could throw at him. He specialized in extended expeditions into remote areas where most tourists never ventured, places that required technical skills, physical endurance, and the kind of judgment that kept groups safe when they were days away from help. His reputation was solid enough that clients would specifically request him when booking trips through the outfitter company he worked for. The April trek into Yellowstone's most remote territory was supposed to be routine. 5 days, 4 clients, a circular route through the thoroughfare region that would cover nearly 40 miles of pristine wilderness. The group was small but experienced. 2 brothers from Colorado who backpacked regularly, a retired geologist who wanted to see the backcountry geology, and a photographer hoping to capture early spring landscapes. They were all prepared for the conditions. Snow still blanketed much of the high country, and temperatures at night would drop below freezing. They set out on a Tuesday morning under clear skies, hiking through forests still dormant from winter. The trail was well marked initially, but as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the markers became less frequent. This was intentional. The Park Service maintained minimal infrastructure in the thoroughfare to preserve its wild character. Henry navigated by GPS, topographic maps, and landmarks he had memorized from previous trips. On the second day, they discovered the first abandoned camp. It appeared suddenly as they crested a ridge overlooking a small meadow. A tent, still standing but with its door hanging open, sat in the center of the clearing. Gear was scattered around it in a pattern that suggested chaos rather than organization. Henry held up his hand to stop the group while he surveyed the scene. "Stay here," he told them, then approached the camp carefully. The tent was a North Face model, expensive and relatively new. Inside, he found a sleeping bag partially unzipped, a backpack with food still packed, and personal items scattered on the tent floor. But no person, he called out several times, his voice echoing across the meadow. No response. What disturbed him most were the tracks. Fresh boot prints led away from the tent toward the tree line, clearly visible in the patches of snow. But after about 30 feet, they simply stopped, not faded or obscured, but ended abruptly as if the person making them had vanished mid-stride. Henry photographed the scene and used his satellite phone to call Park Dispatch. He reported the location and described what they had found. The dispatcher promised to send rangers to investigate and asked Henry to continue his planned route unless he felt the situation posed immediate danger to his group. Henry agreed, though unease settled over him like a cold fog. They hiked for another 6 hours before making camp. The group was subdued, the abandoned tent weighing on everyone's mind. Henry tried to maintain a normal atmosphere, cooking dinner and telling stories about previous trips, but the effort felt forced. On the third day, they found another camp. This one was 5 miles from the first, in a completely different drainage, but the setup was eerily identical. Same brand of tent, same scattered gear pattern, same fresh boot prints leading away into nothing. Henry felt his skin prickle. This was beyond coincidence. He examined the campsite more carefully this time. The boot prints were the same size and tread pattern as the first site. Identical, as if made by the same person or the same boots. But that made no sense. The camps were separated by difficult terrain and a significant elevation change. No one could have moved between them and set up identical scenes in the time frame the evidence suggested. The geologist in their group, a man named Dr. Patterson, helped Henry document everything. They took measurements, photographs, GPS coordinates. Patterson examined the boot prints with professional interest and confirmed what Henry already suspected. They were not just similar. They were identical in every detail, as if someone had made one set of prints and then somehow duplicated them perfectly at a second location. That night, Henry barely slept. He lay in his tent listening to the wind move through the pines, his mind working through possibilities and finding none that made sense. In the morning, he called Park Dispatch again with an update. The dispatcher sounded genuinely concerned and promised that rangers were mobilizing a search effort. She asked if Henry wanted to abort his trip and return to the trailhead. He conferred with his clients and they agreed to continue. They were already more than halfway through the circuit, and returning would actually take longer than completing the planned route. On the fourth day, they found a third camp. This time, there was still a fire smoldering in the ring. Coals glowed red beneath ash, suggesting someone had been there within the past few hours. Food was cooking on a grate, a pot of what looked like dehydrated stew sitting over the heat. Steam rose from it. The tent door was closed but unzipped. Henry's heart hammered as he approached. He called out louder than before. "Hello, is anyone here? We are not a threat. We found your other camps and reported them to park rangers. Do you need help?" Silence. He looked back at his group, who stood in a tight cluster at the edge of the clearing, all of them visibly frightened now. Henry reached the tent and pulled the door flap open. Inside, he found a journal lying open on top of a sleeping bag. The pages were covered in handwriting, frantic and cramped. Henry picked it up and began reading, his hands starting to shake. The entries described a solo backpacking trip through the Thorough Fair. Same dates they were hiking, same route. The writer described feeling watched hearing sounds that did not belong, seeing movement in the trees that vanished when directly observed. Then the entries became more disturbing. The writer described seeing their own face in the distance, standing at the tree line, watching. They described hearing their own voice calling from the forest, using their name, saying things they had never said. The final entry, dated today, read, "I know I am not alone anymore. Something is following me. Something that looks like me. I see it every night now, standing just outside the firelight. It is learning. It is getting closer. I tried to leave, but found myself setting up camp again with no memory of deciding to do so. I think I have been here before. I think this has happened before. The camps I keep finding are mine. All of them. Different versions of me, trapped in this loop. If you are reading this, run. Get out of the thoroughfare. Do not let it see you. Do not let it learn your face." Henry lowered the journal, his mind reeling. He heard one of his clients gasp behind him and turned to see what had caught their attention. At the edge of the clearing, a figure stood watching them. For a moment, Henry thought it was another hiker. Then his brain processed what he was seeing, and his blood turned to ice. The figure was him. Same height, same build, same clothing down to the specific jacket and pack he was wearing. Same face. It was Henry, standing 50 feet away, staring at him with an expression that was not quite right. Too blank, too still, like a mask of his face rather than his actual face. They locked eyes across the clearing. The double raised one hand in a slow wave. The gesture was deliberate, mechanical, as if performed by someone who had observed waving but did not truly understand its purpose. "Run," Henry whispered to his group. Then louder, "Run!" They ran, crashed through the forest, abandoning any pretense of following trails or maintaining formation. Pure panic drove them, branches whipping at their faces, snow and mud splashing up from their boots. Henry risked one look back and saw the double following, not running, but walking with that same mechanical precision, matching their pace exactly despite the terrain. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give out. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath in a narrow ravine, the double was gone. But Henry knew with absolute certainty that it was still there, somewhere in the forest, learning, watching, waiting. They hiked through the night, navigation be damned, focused only on putting distance between themselves and whatever they had encountered. They reached a ranger station at dawn, stumbling out of the trees like refugees from a war zone. Henry tried to explain what they had seen, but the words sounded insane, even to him. Park rangers organized a search operation that lasted 3 weeks. They found 7 abandoned campsites, arranged in a rough circle within, a 10-mile radius of where Henry had seen his double. All identical. All with the same boot prints leading nowhere. The journal Henry had found disappeared from evidence, later reported as misplaced during processing. No official explanation was ever provided for the campsites or the tracks. Henry stopped guiding in that region. He still works as a wilderness guide, but he refuses trips into the thoroughfare. 2 years after the incident, he received a call from a park ranger he had never met. The ranger had found a campsite with Henry's name on the gear tags. Sleeping bag, backpack, even personal items with his initials. But Henry was home in Montana, 800 miles away. The ranger sent photos. The gear was identical to what Henry owned, down to specific wear patterns and repairs. The thoroughfare region was quietly closed to overnight camping shortly after. The official reason cited was wildlife management and habitat protection. But rangers who work the area know the real reason. They tell stories in hushed voices about the place where reality folds back on itself. where something lives that can mirror you perfectly, learn your patterns, become you. They say 7 hikers have vanished there since the 1970s, and their gear is always found arranged in camps that form perfect circles, as if marking the boundary of something that should not be crossed. Henry does not talk about that trip anymore. When pressed, he will only say that some places exist outside the rules that govern normal reality, and that the wilderness holds phenomena we were never meant to understand. He warns other guides to trust their instincts. If a place feels wrong, if you see something that should not be possible, if you encounter your own face staring back at you from the tree line, do not try to rationalize it. Do not try to understand it. Just run. And do not stop running until you are back in the world where cause and effect still function the way they should. Because in places like the thoroughfare, those rules do not always apply, and something there has learned to watch, to copy, to become. Whatever it takes from you, you will never get back. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, versions of those who stayed too long still walk, trapped in loops they can never escape, setting up camps they will abandon, following trails that lead nowhere, forever searching for an exit that exists in their memory, but not in their reality.